testimony would then equally apply to whatever oral testimony is
Yes.
submitted on cross-examination. So
Yes.
it's an across-the-board motion.
That is my understanding as well. I'm, of course, considering the efficiency of the amount of time that will be needed for direct as well as cross of those three witnesses. But we will take your request under consideration. We could definitely say that do not expect those witnesses to come tomorrow. We will give you any further indication tomorrow, but we will not plan to hear from them tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, Ms. Nichol is not here. Oh, Ms. Nichol is here. Ms. Nichol.
I am here. Given the scheduling uncertainties, I think I'm just going to proceed here with my cross and then see what happens. There's all sorts of moving schedules here. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Meredith Nichol. I'm here on behalf of the Sacramento Valley Group, the Tehama-Colusa Canal Authority, and the North Delta Water Agency. I just have a few brief questions for Dr. Earle. And Dr. Earle, these questions arise out of your expertise on the Adaptive Management Plan, which was referenced in DWR Exhibit 1143, the second revised. And specifically, I'm referring to footnote 38, if Mr. Long could bring that up. Thank you. That's fine. It's pretty long. So, Dr. Earle, are you familiar with this footnote?
Mr. Long, would you please scroll up a little more? I'm sorry, I don't recall where this appears in the Adaptive Management Plan.
So as you sit here today, Dr. Earle, do you have any opinion as to whether the Adaptive Management Program would require the petitioners to return to the State Water Board to prove that a change to the spring outflow criteria contained in the incidental take permit would not result in injury to other water users?
I do not have an opinion regarding whether a proposed change conducted under the adaptive management criteria would have any particular regulatory or procedural consequences. That would be determined on the basis of the potential effects of the proposed change.
But within the adaptive management plan itself, there's no requirement under the plan itself to return to the State Water Board? Is that correct?
No, the plan itself, as I noted in my testimony in March, addresses these issues under step 4, which involves implementation of a proposed adaptive management change, at which point, as always, the department is required to comply with all applicable restrictions and regulations.
So if, as suggested by this footnote, there were an alternative operation for spring outflow that would be developed somehow between DWR and CDFW, would the adaptive management plan require DWR to come back to the State Water Board for a change to its water rights?
Objection. Witness just responded that he's unaware as to what would cause return to the Water Board.
Sustain. He doesn't know, Ms. Nichol.
I understood his testimony to be that there was a step in the adaptive management plan that might apply, and so I'm asking about a specific way in which the adaptive management plan might apply. that was my understanding, was that that step 4 had a role or some interaction that could, or requirement that could entail a change to a water right or impact analysis. And I'm trying to understand how that would play with respect to this footnote.
Are you able to answer, Dr. Earl?
As I stated, the implementation occurring under step 4 of the adaptive management plan would be required to comply with all applicable restraints and regulations. Naturally, those would depend upon the specific proposal that was being put forth.
But what was your question again, Ms. Nickel?
Well, my question was, and I don't have a specific proposal, so the answer may be that it depends on the specific proposal, but in the footnote it implies or it suggests that there could be a change to spring outflow or an alternative operation for spring outflow that could be developed between CDFW and the department. And my question is, how would step 4, how would the adaptive management plan apply in that instance to whether or not there would be a change to the department's water rights?
I see.
The adaptive management plan does not specifically prescribe the applications, permit processes, or otherwise that might be required for any change proposed under adaptive management. So the procedure in the event that the circumstances described in footnote 38 were to come to pass is not specified in the adaptive management plan.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Nickel. Ms. Meserve.
I have questions for Dr. Earl based on the subjects that are in his testimony, such as noise, loss of habitat, the transmission lines, basically tracking the topics in his testimony.
Speak more clearly into the microphone and bring it closer to you, Ms. Meserve.
Sure. Let's see. So, Dr. Earl, your testimony, and maybe we could just go ahead and put that up, is DWR 1219. And the first question I had relates to page 6, line 11. And this is where you cite the Popper study. And my question is it your position that consideration of noise frequency would not have improved the analysis you relied on in the final EIR of noise?
That is correct.
And I have an exhibit, which is just an excerpt from the final EIR, which is labeled FSL 54 in the thumb drive I provided this morning. If you could please bring that up. It says FSL 54 there, that one. And are you familiar, Dr. Earl, with the final EIR and what it states about the noise produced by pile drivers here on page 12-148?
I see that line 4 indicates that impact pile driving produces a sound level of approximately 101 dBA at 50 feet distance, and yes, I'm familiar with that.
And in preparing this rebuttal testimony, you reviewed Dr. Schilling's testimony as well as the study cited by him in Land 135.
I do not recall exactly what Land 135 consists of. It's true that I reviewed Dr. Schilling's testimony.
Sorry. Yeah, that's just his testimony.
Then yes, I reviewed Dr. Schilling's testimony.
Okay. And then one of the citations within that is the Popper study that I mentioned. If we could please bring up Land 148, which is that study. I may be misnaming it. It's Dooling and Popper. Land 148, and go to page 35. And I'm going to point you toward language about intermittent sounds that are similar to pile driving. And if we could go to page 35 of that. Scrolling down into the third full paragraph. It discusses noise from aircraft, and pile driving may be similar. And with respect to the comparison, well, I'll give you a chance to review, sorry.
You may proceed.
And if we could look at another exhibit I gave you this morning, which is FSL 55, which is a listing of different noise levels. In the last excerpt, we looked at aircraft noise was mentioned. Are you aware that aircraft noise is around 97 decibels?
I am aware that the amount of noise produced by any source varies quite substantially with distance from the source. So 97 decibels, if that appears in this exhibit, I don't see it at the moment, is only a meaningful number if presented in the context of a distance at which it has been measured.
Understood. If it was at the correct distance, would you agree that aircraft sounds could be analogous to pile driving sounds in the point that they would be intermittent?
Acoustically, aircraft sounds and pile driving sounds are very different. Aircraft sounds typically grow gradually as the plane approaches, have a peak level, and then diminish as the plane goes away. Pile driving sounds are almost instantaneous in going from no noise to maximum noise, and also have a very rapid cessation. These differences account for substantial behavioral differences in animals that are exposed to those sounds.
So would you also agree that highway noise would be a lot different from pile driving noise?
Yes. Highway noise is generally continuous, and it also has different attenuation with distance compared to pile driving noise, because highway noise is essentially a linear noise source, whereas pile driving noise is a point source in most cases.
So looking at your testimony at page 6, don't you appear to be equating on lines 13 and 14 highway noise with pile driving noise in a way that would not be appropriate?
I would say no. I appear to be quoting Dooling and Popper with regard to their analysis of frequency effects. It may be that you misunderstood my use of the word frequency. The term frequency here is not intended to mean how often something happens, but to indicate how many cycles per second the sound is produced at.
So, but do you still think that highway noise would be relevant to consideration of the pile driving noise as was assumed in the EIR?
The two are relevant. The analysis in the EIR considered the distance at which a noise would be expected to attenuate to approximately background, or specifically they used a threshold of 50 dBA, which is a common background level of noise in rural areas within the Delta as demonstrated by measurements. And in that case, at that distance, we're talking about a noise which does not actually exceed background. And at smaller distances, somewhat smaller distances, it only exceeds background by a small amount. At such distances, pile driving noise, highway noise, and indeed any source of noise are comparable in having a very low intensity and consequently a low potential to affect the behavior of animals.
Doesn't the FEIR describe that pile driving could be 101 dBA though?
That is correct. 101 dBA at 50 feet, I believe. That would drop by approximately 6 dBA for every time you double the distance from the noise source. I believe it comes out to about half a mile at which pile driving noise would be indistinguishable from background noise.
And using that example, wouldn't there be birds closer than a half mile to the pile driving noise?
Yes, there certainly could, and this is why the final EIS expresses the opinion that such birds could be behaviorally affected by exposure to that noise. Excuse me.
Sorry. And then you agree that the pile driving noise has a unique characteristic because it is intermittent, right, as discussed in the final EIR?
Among other things, yes, it is intermittent.
Which would be different than a freeway noise, for instance, not intermittent, is it?
Freeway noises are typically assumed to be fairly continuous in amplitude.
Have you heard of the, here's another intermittent noise, the use of cannons for bird control?
Yes.
At landfills, for instance. Could we look at another exhibit I had from this morning, which is FSL 56, please? And if we scroll to the next page, this is just an example of a cannon used to disperse birds. It says they're very effective at dispersing birds. Would you agree that this kind of noise would scare a bird?
I object at this point. Is going beyond the scope of Dr. Earle's rebuttal testimony. Again, as he qualified it earlier in response to Ms. Meserve's question, the citation Ms. Meserve is questioning him about talks about frequency as in, well, I think Dr. Earle described it better than I could, not being a frequency in time, but a frequency in oscillation or something.
In occurrence.
Well, not in occurrence, not frequency in occurrence, but frequency in...
Yes, not frequency in occurrence. That's what I meant.
So at this point, I fail to see the connection of this line of questioning to the statement referenced in Dr. Earle's testimony.
Ms. Meserve?
Well, I think that on page 6 and thereafter, we're talking about the character of the noises that are analyzed. Dr. Earle is attempting to rebut statements made by Dr. Schilling about the character of those noises. So I don't think everything is tied to frequency. I think it's also tied to the character of the noise, which I think is back to this instantaneous short duration point.
Okay, overruled.
So I think I had a question pending. Would you agree that these types of cannon shots could scare birds?
And how does this, I'm sorry, make the connection for me of this one example of a cannon? You're not asking them to opine about the specific, maker or model, but so what is the linkage here? What characteristic you are going for?
What I'm trying to do is provide a more apt example of a noise that would be similar to a pile driving, more similar, for instance, than a freeway noise.
Okay. Are you familiar with these type of cannons, Dr. Earle?
I am aware that cannons of this type have been used to haze birds that are in undesirable situations. They're used at airports and golf courses, for instance, typically to keep waterfowl away from areas where they could either be an inconvenience or a safety hazard. And I'm aware that when used consistently and at short distances, they can be effective in eliminating birds from a local area.
And how would their noise compare to that of the?
It is similar
Okay.
to the noise of a pile driver in the sense that it has a very rapid rise time and a very rapid fall time, and it has been found to elicit a startle response from birds. But it's important to note that it has to be loud to work. In other words, it has to be close to the bird. Similarly, pile driving would have to be, a bird would have to be quite close to the pile driving to be disturbed by this sort of phenomenon.
So would you agree then, I think you already did, that the intermittent noise characteristic of the pile driving differs substantially from busy roads, residential areas, and agricultural equipment referenced in your testimony?
If we could please pull up my testimony, I'm not quite certain what terminology you're referring to.
I think it's on page 6. Let me find it. Line 16 of page 7, sorry. States most of the delta is already subject to noise.
I see this. Would you please repeat your question?
Given that pile drivers have a unique intermittent noise characteristic, as described in the EIR, don't sounds from pile driving differ substantially from busy roads, residential areas, and agricultural equipment mentioned on page 7 of your testimony?
I have not reviewed the acoustic data that have been collected in this area. I would say that they probably do differ appreciably from busy roads. Residential areas, it's harder to say, but typically residential areas have relatively low rates of noise production. Agricultural equipment, the noise produced by such equipment is highly variable depending upon the equipment in question. As to the question whether, for instance, as it says here, sandhill cranes and other species are accustomed to the noise from pile driving, or noise that's comparable to that, it would be speculative for me to conclude at this time.
So you're not aware of noises similar to the pile driving noise that you're opining about already being present in the Delta, are you?
I'm sure pile driving noise is occasionally present in the Delta, but we did not specifically evaluate differing bird responses to pile driving as opposed to other noises because, as I stated earlier, we concluded that there was a potential impact anytime the noise was appreciably in excess of the acoustic background. The determination in the EIR-EIS was that in spite of that, there would still be a less than significant effect. Most of the areas that would be exposed to relatively loud noises, and by that I mean greater than maybe 70 or 80 decibels, would actually be within the construction areas that had already been cleared and where birds were presumably absent. So very few birds could be exposed to noises as high as those generated by pile driving, except perhaps for birds that were located on the river next to where the pile driving was occurring. And that's a relatively low level of insonification. The birds affected by that process do not belong to sensitive species, and therefore it was concluded that it did not represent a significant adverse effect.
And so in your analysis, did you equate the lack of a significant adverse effect with what I think you phrased as reasonable protection for wildlife?
Well, as I stated in my testimony in March, my opinion that the California water fix would be reasonably protective of wildlife is based not only upon my own analysis and the analysis presented in the various environmental documents, but also on the concurrence with that analysis that we've received from the various agencies whose jurisdiction is the protection of fish and wildlife in California, essentially agreeing with our analysis.
Was there any analysis of reasonable protection for greater sandhill cranes in the ITP?
The ITP is an incidental take statement that authorizes take of species that are listed under the California Endangered Species Act. The greater sandhill crane is a fully protected species. There is no authorization of take for this species unless under the isolated circumstance of preparing a natural community conservation plan, which is not relevant in this case. Therefore, there is no mention anywhere in the incidental take permit of the greater sandhill crane.
So the answer is no, there's no analysis, correct?
There is no reference to it in the incidental take permit.
So at least with respect to sandhill crane, greater sandhill crane, your prior statement would not apply, correct?
Objection.
I'm sorry, which prior statement is that?
The statement that the permits obtained by the project would have analyzed effects on birds from noise.
On the contrary, the greater sandhill crane is evaluated at length in the final EIR-EIS, which was reviewed and commented on by all of the Fish and Wildlife agencies, and which was nominally authored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
That's not a permit, is it?
An authorization. But I do not pretend to understand the legal niceties here.
Okay, well, I'm just want to be clear, there's no permit. And there is no federal record of decision with respect to the EIR-EIS either, is there?
It is my understanding that that has not yet been issued.
Now, on the issue of transmission line markers and their effectiveness, that's discussed on page 15 of your testimony. And let's see, you discussed that there's an addendum was issued that would with the effect of a substantial reduction in the proposed length of the transmission lines. Do you see that part of your testimony?
Yes, I do.
If we could go to an exhibit that is within FSL, and that's FSL 48, page 2. And this is an example of the new proposed transmission lines. And
You mean FSL 58?
I'm sorry, it's 48? I'm sorry, FSL 48. It's something that's in our existing exhibit list. Sorry about that. Uh, 48. FSL 48. I think we're going to have to go under the Friends of Stone Lakes. If you scroll down toward the bottom. There you go. And this is an exhibit, if we could go to page 2 of that, we discussed earlier that this is similar to the proposed transmission lines that are discussed in your testimony on page 15 as being subject to the addendum.
I'm going to object. We have a line of questioning here that goes to an exhibit that is not directly responsive to Dr. Earle's testimony. His testimony on this point focuses on a critique of modeling and is not discussing the characterization of the transmission line poles and lines. If Ms. Meserve can provide us a closer citation, I'm happy to withdraw that objection.
Actually, I don't even know yet what her question is.
Yeah, I mean, my questions go to this paragraph on page 15 of Dr. Earle's testimony that talks about a substantial reduction in the proposed length. And what my questions go to is, well, what about the character, not just the length? And that's what my questions go to. So I believe it's within the testimony in terms of availability for questioning.
And Ms. Meserve, are you focused solely on Dr. Earle's testimony on page 15, that one paragraph?
That was what I thought was most direct. I can look for some other citations if you'd like.
And Mr. Mizell, let me ask Dr. Earle. Dr. Earle, your testimony, as we see here, is it based solely on a modeling analysis?
I beg your pardon, based solely on which analysis?
On a modeling analysis.
My testimony refers to modeling, but it also refers to substantial changes in the project as proposed, and also to various research that's been performed.
I was looking beyond the first paragraph. The first paragraph speaks solely in terms of length and that in no other characteristics. And the remainder of this section speaks to a critique of the modeling presented by protestants. I'm not aware of any place that discusses other characteristics of the transmission lines, much as Ms. Meserve just indicated. Dr. Earle's testimony is limited to length.
Ms.
Well, I
Meserve?
think I can make these into questions about the modeling, if that would be helpful.
Let's do that.
Okay. So if we could go back to the figure in FSL 48, please. The modeling, if we scroll up to page 1 of this, would have assumed transmission lines, or rather distribution lines that look like the one on the bottom of this page, wouldn't they, Dr. Earle?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
Dr. Earle,
Yeah.
are you able to answer the question based on your knowledge?
I know that the proposed power transmission lines that are described in the addendum do not resemble those shown in the photograph there.
So, given your understanding of the model that you discuss on page 15, isn't it true that the model is assuming lines that are distribution lines with a single layer of lines as shown in the bottom here?
If Mr. Long would bring us back to my testimony, page 15, DWR 1219. Now, if you would please scroll up a little bit. Or, sorry, scroll down. Okay, this discusses a model that was developed by Dr. Ivy for the BDCP. This is actually the model that is referred to by protestants. This is not the model that I advocate the use of in my testimony.
Let's see, well, I think we went over this some before. When I reviewed your testimony, it appeared you weren't taking account on page 15 of the different configuration, which is suggested in the addendum, which is the power line, the transmission line with the distribution underbuild as shown in FSL 48, page 2.
And I object to the question is being beyond the scope. In the question as Ms. Meserve has phrased it, she says it is not within his testimony. So I believe that this is beyond the scope of Dr. Earle's rebuttal testimony, unless we can find a reference to other characteristics of the transmission lines. It's beyond the scope.
I'll just go to the, when you discuss, I'll move on.
You're moving on,
Yes,
okay.
Thanks. Sorry. When you, on page 15, line 11, refer to the reduction in the proposed length of new transmission lines, you don't offer any analysis about a different configuration of transmission lines with underbuilds in that, do you?
That is correct.
And on line 12, you state that the addendum would only further reduce collision risk for birds. But isn't it true that if the power line is a transmission line with an underbuild with several layers of lines, that might increase risks?
Going to object as being beyond the scope of his rebuttal testimony. His conclusion here goes to the reduction in length.
So your conclusion is limited to just the analysis of length?
I think I can add some clarity here. If we can go back to FSL 48, please. The existing power lines on Lambert Road between River Road and I-5, those are distribution lines. The lines that we are modifying along Lambert Road are actually 69 kV lines. They're single pole kV, 69 kV lines, and we're going to make them double pole 69 kV lines. So if you go down, scroll down a bit. So this is a figure. This actually is not what the transmission lines will look like because it has one very specific problem. But right now, the 69 kV lines that run along Lambert Road are basically that same configuration, but with the six wire holders on the top part of the transmission pole. There's only 3. So there's 3 on one side. We will rebuild the existing line so that there's 3 on one side and then 3 on the other side. So basically, the configuration is just adding another set of 3. It's approximately the same height, and it does have a 12 kV underbuilt. I think it's also important to note that this particular transmission line has a shield wire at the top of the pole. The poles that will be used by SMUD do not have that shield wire. That's important because a number of studies have found that the shield wire is particularly problematic from bird strike issue. And one of the, I believe it was Brown et al. Found that roughly 65% of bird strikes are on the shield wire. So again, our transmission lines will not have that shield wire. And it'll be basically that same configuration, except that it'll have 6 wires attached to it instead of just 3.
I might also note that on page 18 of my testimony, DWR 1219, number 4 on page 18, scroll down a little farther, reiterates those points that were just made by Mr. Bradbury.
So, Mr. Bradbury, is it your contention then that there is already a 69 kV transmission line going all the way down Lambert Road?
The part that we will have reconstructed, yes, that's correct.
Is there any figures you could point to that show that?
Can you see? Need the addendum.
That's going to be a DWR exhibit, right?
DWR 1295. And as you scroll down, going. Oh, hold on a second.
There's a figure on page 3.
There's, I think in the description, it talks about how the existing line, what the existing line is, and how it will be modified. I'm not seeing that. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing that right now.
I'm not aware. I mean, we can move on. I just, from my experience, I did go down Lambert Road and I did take that picture, and that's the distribution lines I found. So I was a little confused by your statement.
That distribution line that you took a picture of is actually on the other side of the bridge.
Okay,
And
can we
that is
tie
after we
this
make the
back to
turn
Dr.
the
Earl's
north.
testimony somehow?
Well, I
It
think
was
there's
interesting, but
I know, sorry. There's a factual issue about what the existing line is now and what's being replaced, because Dr. Earl is claiming that the change is a reduction in length that will serve to only further reduce collision. And that's what I'm trying to discover that.
and I believe Mr. Bradbury's explanation was intended to support that finding in Dr. Earl's testimony.
That's correct.
And I guess for the detail of what's there now versus what's proposed, the best reference we have would be this DWR exhibit And so I can study that again later. Let's go to the issue of diverters then. On page 18, line 23 of your testimony, Dr. Earl, you discuss that the collision risk would be lowered by 60%. Do you see that?
Yes.
And is it your opinion that installing flight diverters on power lines is highly effective at averting collisions?
As stated there, they have been found to reduce the incidence of collisions by approximately 60%.
And in making that assertion and citing the Yee study, which is at SOSC 59, you're relying on the Yee study from 2008, is that correct?
I do cite the Yee study in support of that conclusion. That is not the only study that has evaluated this. Comparable numbers have been found by other studies, such as the Brown and Drury, cited in the testimony presented by Save Our Sandhill Cranes.
And just sticking with the Yee study for now, that studied effectiveness of flight diverters on power lines that had only one layer of horizontal lines, isn't that correct?
I don't know. We would have to look at the Yee study to determine that.
That's SOSC 59, page 14. And my question is, isn't it true that those transmission lines in the study would look more like the photo I took? If we look at page 14, you'll see there's, SOSC 59. That's going to be at the bottom of your exhibit list there. And then 59, and then if you scroll to PDF page 28, so that was the line studied in Yee, right?
Yes.
So
I'm not sure if I'd call that's a very vague picture, but it appears to have a ground wire or a shield wire located above the conductors.
would you say it's more similar to the photo I took on Lambert Road than what I had on page 2 of FSL 48?
Yes.
And looking at that configuration, in the example that I provide in FSL 48, page 2, which is the transmission line with the underbuild, wouldn't you agree that this is different in shape than the single layer used in the Yee study?
Yes.
And since the Yee study was based on a single layer of power lines, not the multi-layered lines that would be proposed, do you still think that a 60% reduction with power line collisions reported in Yee would still apply?
Yes. As we noted earlier, the majority of the collisions in any case are on the shield wire, which is both the highest and the thinnest wire in the array. The birds typically are thought to hit the shield wire because they think that they're flying above the transmission wires, and then there's this very narrow wire that they can't see that they hit. I I think it is implausible from a point of view of bird behavior that the bird would try to fly between such an accumulation of wires as are shown in this photograph.
If it was at night or with fog, wouldn't that lead to a more likelihood of the bird hitting it without seeing it?
I agree it is possible to conceive circumstances where there is a substantially higher risk of birds hitting wires than under good visibility and clear skies.
And are you aware that there is more incidence of fog in the Delta than in Colorado, for instance, where the Brown and Drury study was based?
Well, may I remind you that it was Gary Ivey who cited the Brown and Drury study. The Yee study was performed in the Delta.
And the Yee study affirmed that fog can reduce visibility and reduce flight diverter effectiveness. Doesn't it?
I believe he reached that in his conclusions, yes.
And sticking with the Yee study, could we look at SOSC 59 again, please? And sorry, this is going a little slower than I had anticipated. I'll try to keep things moving, but I guess I would request an additional 15 minutes.
Okay, but move faster, Ms. Missouri.
Sorry. Okay. SOSC 59 on page PDF page 41, and the part I want to look at is the fatalities not accounting for biases due to searcher efficiency. In the first paragraph there, if you could take a look at that, Dr. Earl. So the report itself talks about some of the limitations and that there was likely underreporting, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And if there was a 60% reduced mortality rate, as you allege, some birds would still die, wouldn't they?
Yes, yes, it is certainly true that there is a calculable probability that birds would die under any circumstances involving transmission lines and bird flight.
And that would include the greater sandhill crane, which is a fully protected species as well, wouldn't it?
In principle, yes. However, as I note in my testimony, the Yee study found one sandhill crane, not a greater sandhill crane, just one sandhill crane, which represent approximately 15%. Greater sandhill cranes are about 15% of the sandhill crane population in the Delta. Found one bird killed per year. And even allowing for biases due to searcher efficiency, scavenger removal, habitat, and crippling, that's a very small number of birds potentially affected, especially when you consider the extremely small mileage of lines that are currently proposed since the issuance of the addendum. We've calculated that in all probability there would be no mortalities of greater sandhill cranes, but there is an extremely small possibility that a mortality could occur at some point.
And you've stated in your testimony that the effectiveness of the bird diverters is 60%, right? Not 99%.
That's correct.
Moving on to the issue of the Swainson's hawk habitat, in your testimony you talk about, starting on page 19, you respond to Dr. Freeze and Mr. Patrol's testimony. Are you aware that the proposed project changes in the supplemental EIR would increase the amount of agricultural land that would be permanently lost?
I think it would be helpful at this point to bring up Chapter 12 of the supplemental EIR and look at what those acreages are for sandhill cranes.
I'm talking about Swainson's Hawk.
Oh, sorry, Swainson's Hawk.
So that would be SWRCB 113, Chapter 12, page 37. Chapter 12, and then page 37, which has a table showing the habitat lost and gained as a result of the project changes. Page 37. I think.
Mr. Long, if you'd please scroll the page up a little. Or down then. A bit more, please. That's very good, thank you. So as shown here, the proposed changes described in the administrative draft supplemental EIS would show an increase of approximately 136 acres of impact to Swainson's hawk foraging habitat. On the other hand, a substantially decrease of approximately 11 acres out of a former 29 in nesting habitat. Now, if you direct your attention to the lower table there, where we are seeing an increased acreage of impacts on foraging habitat, you will see that there is a very substantial reduction in impacts to moderate quality forage habitat, but a very large increase in impacts to low and very low quality foraging habitat. That is, there has been a net shift in impacts from moderate to very high quality habitat. Instead, we're impacting primarily low and very low quality habitat. This is why we interpret this change as being beneficial for the Swainson's hawk.
So you're adding a lot of low value habitat. I found this table confusing. Are you saying wouldn't low value habitat be lower value for the bird and you're adding a lot of that?
That's correct. Impacts on low value habitat, which have little significance for the birds, have been greatly increased. In compensation for that, impacts to moderate value habitat have been greatly decreased. This means greater forage availability for the sandhill cranes compared to what was proposed in the final EIR-EIS.
Swainson's hawk, you mean to say?
Swainson's hawk.
And how do you consider the plus 41 for the very high habitat?
That is an adverse impact.
So you're losing.
But it is proportionally a very small adverse impact, approximately 5%.
There's very little habitat in the valley for Swainson's hawk under current development conditions, though. Isn't that true? Of high value.
I can answer that. That's not true. Actually, there's quite a lot of very high value habitat in the Delta. Swainson's hawks primarily like to forage alfalfa. Alfalfa is the most heavily used, and there is quite a lot of alfalfa in the Delta and around the areas where the project will occur.
Okay. I think I'm going to leave the questions off at that. Thank you for your indulgence. And I'll allow the next questioner up.
All right. Mr. Jackson, you're up. And Candace, are you okay with going to about 2:30 and then we'll take a break then? Okay.